What's up, gentlemen? This is Rising Phoenix Podcast, the podcast about how to rise up after your divorce. I'm your host, Michael Rhodes. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Beth Kurland. Beth, let's just jump right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, so thank you so much for having me on here. So I am, I wear a lot of different hats, I think of. One is that I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been in practice for, I would say, over 27, I think I've lost track, 27, 28 years.
Wow.
And I see people really across the lifespan, and very passionate about the work I do. And actually, on that note, I hope it's okay if I throw out this little disclaimer.
Sure.
Which I like to always share when I'm giving talks and speaking in front of people. It's just that whatever I share today is strictly for educational purposes only, and is not intended in as any way psychological, intervention or treatment of any kind.
Gotcha.
I certainly encourage, and actually happy to talk about this at some point, but encourage anybody who may be struggling with mental health issues to seek the, guidance of a licensed mental health professional in their state. But anyway, so throwing that out there, just my psychology hat there.
Yeah.
But I also do mind body wellness coaching. I'm the author of 3 books. I started writing books after my oldest. I have 2 children. They're both in their mid-20s now, but my daughter went off to college, and I had all this creative energy and started writing. So I wrote 3 books, 2 of which are focused on really reducing stress and cultivating well-being. And then a 3rd book, which is a book of poetry. So fun. Awesome. Fun creative expression there. I love public speaking. I had an opportunity to do TEDx talk just before the pandemic, which was awesome. Nice. I created an online course called the Wellbeing Toolkit, and I do some blog writing for Psychology Today. I've created a bunch of meditations on Insight Timer and some audio courses. So a lot of creative things that I really love. And I think underlying all of it is my interest in this merging of neuroscience and psychology, of mind, body, and spirit, and really trying to make sense of it all, really kind of based on, I think, my own struggles, my own humanness. I came into the world, I believe, wired kind of high stress, a little bit more on that type A end, and certainly with a good bit of anxiety in there. And so one of my graduate professors said that we teach people what we most need to learn ourselves. And I see myself really as gravitating towards a lot of things I'm so passionate about, because they're also things that really help me.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that. So how I found you was the Psychology Today blog, and it discussed dark emotions. So let's dive into that. What are the dark emotions?
So the way I think about dark emotions is really emotions that are difficult. Maybe we'd label as difficult. Some people may label as even bad, or I don't want to feel those things. I think important, and I'll get into this, to not kind of go with good or bad, but that's our inherent reaction. But they're unpleasant. They're uncomfortable to feel. And so we naturally have this inclination to avoid, or to turn away from, or to want to escape. And interestingly, that's really wired into our biology. We are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And that helped us survive, helped our Stone Age ancestors survive. And a lot of the pain that they needed to avoid back then was external physical threats, such as the saber-toothed tigers and so forth. But we have carried this wiring along with us, and yet now often the way that it can be expressed for us in our modern lives is also avoiding our internal uncomfortable experiences, such as sadness or anxiety or frustration or anger, or those kinds of emotions that are not so pleasant to feel. So that's a little bit about how I think about those, more dark emotions, if you will. Certainly grief would fall in there for sure.
Yeah,
As
that's one that's relevant for sure here. So let's talk about we'll get into the benefits and the hows and all that kind of good stuff. But let's talk about first the consequences of not. What happens when you avoid these things? Sadness and grief, perhaps, in particular. Although obviously there's others to throw in there, shame. But let's try and stick with those two of grief and sadness.
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things that happen. And I guess this really, in my mind, applies to all of the emotions in some ways. But I think of it a couple of different analogies. So one is this kind of finger trap dilemma. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of those gag toys where
Sure.
you put your finger, one finger in each end.
Yep.
And this is actually a metaphor from ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. So this is not, I didn't come up with this, but this idea that you stick your finger in each end, and the harder you try to pull your fingers out, the more stuck you get. So, spoiler alert, that way to get out is actually to push your fingers counterintuitive, like in towards each other. But the point here is that as we fight against our internal emotions, as we try to, and often I think the ways that people can react to feeling sadness or grief is trying to ignore it, trying to push it away. We can end up inadvertently, not meaning to, but getting stuck in it. Other ways that I think about this are, imagine putting a lid on a pot of boiling water, and that eventually, that steam has nowhere to go. And so it's just going to start to sort of spill over. It's going to show up in other ways. Another analogy might be, imagine carrying, this heavy suitcase, and that there may be things that happen, painful events in our life, that create these emotions at that certain time. And if we don't process those emotions, it's sort of like carrying that heavy suitcase everywhere we go. There isn't that opportunity to really set it down and be able to move forward in some ways.
Yeah.
Last analogy I have is, and this is another one from ACT, from acceptance and commitment therapy, but I think it's a really interesting, helpful one, is this idea of, it's called the unwelcome party guest, or something along those lines. Imagine you're throwing a big party and you have all these people arriving, and all of a sudden this person arrives who's this unwanted guest. He's kind of unseemly, and he's, not very polite, and you don't want him at the party. So you're standing there at the door. In order to, keep him out, you have to stand there at the door, holding the door closed so that he doesn't push his way in. But as you're doing that, then you're not able to be at the party. You're not able to enjoy and mingle with your guests and do all the things you want to be doing, because you're holding that door shut so tightly. And so I think that we can end up doing this with some of these more difficult emotions and not realize that, there's a lot of ways that, and I can talk more about the biology, but this idea that there's some underlying survival tendencies we have, and ways that these behaviors may be trying to protect us, and yet it can also prevent us from really being able to fully experience and live our lives.
So how much of this, when you're going through something like a divorce or a breakup, I think divorce especially hits harder for various reasons, but how much do you balance out? Because I see and hear this all the time, in terms of doing stuff, sort of distracting yourself. So go to the gym, go to the movies, go to dinner, like go out and experience life. And how much of a balance is that do you need to have there? Because I feel like some part of that advice is detrimental because it causes you to ignore it, right? But I also think you can't sit in the corner and cry all day long. So how much of a balance is there? How much distraction is I know that probably is hard to quantify, but maybe the question is, how do you know if you're ignoring it too much and distracting too much?
That's a really great question, and a really interesting question to consider. I think one is this idea of really learning how to attend to our own body signals. And I can talk more about that and how we do that. But I think that's a really important piece, to pay attention to what's going on inside of me. I know for me, there are some times when I'm feeling sadness or loss or grief about something, and to make the space for myself to sit, and whether I journal, whether I just reflect, whether I talk to somebody about it, allowing those feelings to come up I feel then some release and some freedom internally in my body when I do that. And so that's a helpful signal to say, yeah, this emotion needs some space.
Yeah.
No, I need some time to process this. I think we can get stuck in our stories. We can get stuck in our heads. We can so emotions need to be felt in the body in order to be fully processed and move through. We can get stuck in our heads, and we can get stuck in unhelpful ruminations and stories about whatever difficult events may be occurring. So when we are more in these mental loops and these unhelpful ruminations, that can especially be a time to take more action, to engage in behaviors. And sometimes, and let me throw this out too, that sometimes we can just be really overwhelmed emotionally, that it just feels too big and too overwhelming, that to make the space in this moment to sit and try to turn towards that is not going to be beneficial.
Right.
And so in that case, it may be more wise and skillful to say, okay, what can I do where I can put my attention on something? And I want to redefine a little bit. I do this often for my clients, this idea of distraction. I kind of flip it sometimes, and I call it the undistraction technique, if you will. It depends on what we're talking about, but especially if we're talking about more mental rumination.
Sure.
That our minds like to create these stories, these narratives that we get stuck in. And when we make the decision to say, hey, okay, I'm stuck in this dark place, I'm just thinking about all these negative thoughts right now, and I'm really dragging me down here, say, okay, I'm going to go to the gym, or I'm going to reach out with a buddy and, meet up and do something, or go for a walk. When we can find things that bring us into the present moment, okay, I'm engaged with whatever activity I'm doing, we're actually undistracting. We're stepping out of those mental ruminations and bringing ourselves back into the present moment of what's happening here and now. So that can be grounding, that can be helpful. And even when there may be more emotional overwhelm, to just be able to focus on what's here, my five senses, present moment, something that can engage me, doing a puzzle for somebody. I'm thinking of people sometimes who have gone through enormous grief, and they just feel so overwhelmed by their emotions. Being able to do something like focusing on a jigsaw puzzle can help ground and stabilize them. So there's an interesting balance of trying to make space for these emotions, but being able to tune in enough inside ourselves to know what we might need at any given point.
Yeah. I think rumination is I think it's one I think probably we all struggle with. I could be wrong there, but it feels like everyone I talk to, like that's the thing. And I think we'll probably get into the how to embrace these dark emotions. The how of it will probably come up, but I want to touch on it a little bit though. Ruminating, because a lot of times I'll talk to guys and they'll be like, and I'll say, listen, you need to reflect and understand what happened, but not sit with it. But when they sort of sit, or when they try to do that, when they try to reflect, they end up just ruminating over and over. And I think what that is, I think, to my layman's term, is they're just they're avoiding actually feeling something. If they can outthink the problem, they won't have to feel the problem. And I think that's again, I don't know the percentages or how many, but it feels like a whole lot of people that is a protection mechanism from actually feeling. Is that how you see rumination, or how do you see rumination?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of describing it, that oftentimes, our brains are often constantly trying to problem solve and figure out solutions. The problem is that when we're dealing with difficult emotions, especially things like a heartbreak or things like that, they're not always solutions to be had.
Right.
They're not hard and fast solutions. There might be helpful action steps we can take at points, and that's great to identify that. But the mind often likes to loop around almost in these dead end circles, trying to find our way out of something where you're absolutely right. I think there are times when we just need to make contact with what those feelings are in order to help process what's there.
Yeah. And that can be difficult. And I think we'll get into that, because I know how to do that myself. I've learned this skill, and it is a skill, I believe, to drop into my body, to figure out, what is this emotion doing to my body? Like physically, is it tightness here, a tension here, or whatever, certain things that I've learned. But let's talk about, before we get into that sort of stuff, like, let's talk about the whys. Why would we want to embrace these dark emotions? Why would we want to feel these feelings?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So there's a saying in psychology that is, what you resist persists. And there's a good amount of research, especially in the mindfulness literature, that when we can turn towards rather than away from some of these uncomfortable emotions, that we actually experience greater psychological well-being. So interestingly, some of the research suggests that when we turn towards our cravings, for example, we're less likely to get stuck in addictive behaviors. When we can bring curiosity, and I think curiosity is a wonderful word to think about in terms of approaching this. When we have curiosity, there's more openness. Isn't that interesting that I notice this tightness in my body right now, or wow, there's this sinking feeling that's happening. Let me be curious about that. Let me see, what is that? What is that about? When we can turn towards our physical pain, there's interesting research that suggests that we become less stuck in chronic pain cycles. When we can actually notice more mindfully, and I can, define that a little bit more. When we turn towards our sadness, we tend to be less likely to be stuck in depression. And when we turn towards anxiety, we're less likely to be stuck or paralyzed by it, or more able to move through it or take meaningful actions and things like that. So another really interesting thing is that some of the research has looked at, what's happening in the brain when we're experiencing different emotions and difficult emotions, and has found that just the simple act of noticing and naming what we're feeling dials down this part of our brain, the amygdala, which is responsible for in part responsible for our threat reaction, that part of our brain that sends a whole cascade of messages to our body that brings us into, kind of more of a fight or flight response. Can say more about that, but when we can just simply notice and name what we're feeling, that turns down that response in the brain, that creates a little bit more sense of, takes the intensity.
Why is that? Why? I mean, is that possible to quantify that or define that? Like why if I say, for instance, and you can correct me or give a better example, but if I sit and feel, say I feel really hurt by her cheating, let's just say, I'm just throwing it out there.
Mhm.
What does that do, or how does that work that it causes some type of relief?
So one of the things that I would say in my understanding is that when we get caught in emotions, when we're swept in them, and I think we all can think of experiences, I certainly can myself,
Sure.
anger is an easy one
Oh yeah.
to think about, where sometimes, we get triggered and we're
Yes.
just in it. And it's like, you can be 0 to 60. It's very, it sweeps you away.
Yep.
And so when we're able to notice and name, it's activating a different part of our brain to be able to do the noticing. And so it's turning on this part of our brain that allows us to kind of take a half step back. And now, instead of being caught in it, we're observing it a little bit more, let's say, ideally non-judgmentally. That may not always happen. There may be judgments to get, in terms of, why am I feeling this? But in terms of a mind, practicing or learning, and like you said, there's these skills, right?
Yeah.
Learning mindfulness is to be able to notice and name it from a non-judgmental place.
Right.
I notice that I'm feeling a lot of anger right now. It allows us to take that half step back again. It's activating a different part of the brain, and we step out of those circuits that are just looping us, pulling us right in.
So when you're in those states, like let's call them fight or flight, freeze, fawn, whatever, everyone has different definitions, or I've heard different definitions. Fawn is a newer one that I've heard recently, 6 months or so. You're almost in the same type of, your brain is locked into the same similar state, right? You're not in a logical, rational, hey, let me think about this type of brain, for lack of, again,
we're in survival mode.
Yeah. Okay. So the excellent description. So you're in survival mode. You're not able to think rationally, and so if you're in, let's call it freeze, because you're just hurt and you don't know what to do, and you're just distraught and you're sad and you're miserable. You can't see a path. You have no hope because you're not using a rational brain, right? And so isn't this really about being mindful to take a step back, to maybe breathe, or do something to sort of calm yourself in some kind of way, or maybe even just the noticing is enough to calm yourself, to then get into a rational brain and go, okay, my life's not over. I'm still breathing. There's all these other things. I mean, that's kind of basically the what we're trying to achieve in when we do those, take those breaths or whatever it is to be mindful, is to get us to a rational place, essentially, right?
Yeah, I would say definitely that there are these different parts of our nervous system. And so it really starts in the nervous system. And I think it's really helpful to think about it that way.
Yeah.
To recognize that all of our emotions have a purpose, and many of the core emotions evolved to help us survive in different ways, both more what we would think of as positive and negative emotions. But a lot of this really starts in our nervous system, in our autonomic nervous system. So we have this part of our brain that's constantly scanning our environment for cues of threat and danger, or for cues of safety. And often this happens outside of our conscious awareness. And when we pick up on cues of threat, and in this case, it could be somebody giving you a not so happy look, or maybe somebody who's averts their eyes, or it could be a lot of subtle things.
Right.
Our nervous system responds to those cues in a way trying to protect us. It reads those as, okay, that's a cue of threat. And so it triggers a whole cascade of biochemical and other changes in our body. Our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up. So we initially try to respond to that by either fighting, as in fighting the saber-toothed tiger, or running the heck away. Right. Those are our classic fight or flight responses. And of course, in our modern lives, that can look like, anger, that can look like fear or anxiety, and everything in between there. And then when the threat may be overwhelming for us in some way, or life-threatening, although again, in our modern lives, hopefully we don't, experience that too often. But it could just be emotionally overwhelming. Then we can go into more of a shutdown mode, a freeze mode. And I think more of the, depression certainly lives down there, as well as just, avoidance and sometimes procrastination, stuckness, those kinds of things. And so our nervous system is always trying to protect us. And so it's helpful just to name that when whatever is happening, what I'm feeling, okay, thank you, nervous system, for trying to protect me. And here's where, so that's like, yes, my survival brain has been activated. And I'm having this reflexive automatic response that is my body's way of trying to protect me. It may not always be the most helpful given the modern day life current circumstances. And so that's where, and this is circling back to what you were saying, to be able to turn on a different part, our most newly evolved part of our nervous system, involves this social engagement system. But when that part of our nervous system is turned on, we feel safe and we feel in connection with others. And so if we can be aware that I'm having a survival response, we can then do things to actively turn on this other part of our nervous system, or access, if you will, this other part of our nervous system that allows us to feel more safe in connection. And when we have access to that most newly evolved part of our autonomic nervous system, that's where we have the greatest perspective taking. We feel more calm. We can see a bigger picture. We have access to more creativity and creative resources and problem solving, and we have access to a lot more of our own inner resources to be able to step back and say, okay, wow, this is a really hard situation. What might be helpful here? So some of it is really about learning how to, number one, notice, okay, I'm having a survival response, either fight, flight, or shut down in some ways. And when that's happening, how can I help regain control of my nervous system to shift me into a more safe physiology, where my nervous system is picking up some cues of safety, because that's going to help me see a bigger picture. That's going to help me proceed in maybe the most skillful way.
And this is a skill, and you have to practice it, right? You can't do it one time or one moment. If you're in the middle of let's say, I mean, I see a lot of anger in my support group, so we can go with that one. But I think but also sadness is also the one that sometimes I think concerns me more in some ways, because I think anger is somewhat simpler, because I think ultimately, and this is just my view, anger is usually just it's a surface emotion. It's usually covering something else, and if we can learn to get under it, but be that as it may, I do see a lot of anger. So if you're angry you just had an interaction with your ex and she wants more money, or doesn't want to give you the kids, or whatever it is, right? And you're super pissed and
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to go, oh, I'm really pissed off, and then suddenly you're going to calm down and everything's going to be okay. And even if you are, right, that's just one time. It truly is, right, a skill that you must practice each and every time that you have these emotions and feelings. I mean, is that correct?
I definitely think of it as a skill. There's a neuropsychologist who I really appreciate his research, Richard Davidson at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I heard him in an interview once say that well-being is fundamentally no different than learning to play the cello. And that it is a skill that we can cultivate, and we need to, at least for myself, I can speak, I need to keep practicing it.
Yeah.
It's not a one and done.
No,
for sure.
no, definitely not. So let's move on to the how then, because we kind of been covering it, but let's talk about the how to embrace these dark emotions and to really to feel them. How do you describe that action of the how of feeling these dark emotions?
Yeah, so lots of different pieces I could throw out here. The first one that I'll say is, I think of the tool of a flashlight. And imagine that you're walking around, pitch black room, there's obstacles and so forth. In the darkness, you'd be tripping over things, you'd be stumbling and so forth. And if somebody hands you a flashlight, suddenly the room is illuminated and the obstacles don't go away, but you can see more clearly, can navigate with greater ease. And so when we begin to carry this flashlight around metaphorically, right, throughout our day, and begin to notice what's happening in my body, what's happening in my nervous system, what am I feeling, it can help to shift what's going on. And I'm going to give you an example in a moment of that. But some of the things that we can notice are, like I said, noticing, naming our emotions. Just what can I label? Like, what's going on in here? We can notice physical sensations in our body. I feel tightness in my chest. Oh, my heart's starting to beat faster. Oh, I feel like some kind of dropping in my stomach. My arms are really tense, right? So noticing physical body sensations, emotions, as I mentioned, and we can notice what our thoughts are. And I think that can be really helpful, especially because often our thoughts create more suffering for us. The kinds of things we say to ourselves, like, hey, I'm feeling sad, but then I say to myself, oh my God, what's wrong with me that I'm feeling so sad, or that I must be weak, or I don't want to be, whatever we attach to that, right? That narrative often can increase our suffering. So it can be helpful to begin to pay attention to what those thoughts are. And then the last thing we can notice is how am I inclined to act? Am I pulled toward doing something that's going to be unhelpful or maybe unhealthy, or not? And so that flashlight, if we remember to turn it on, is a way of really checking in and beginning to notice these different dimensions of our experience. And a little exercise that I do with people sometimes, and this is just really short, but can throw it out here, is I'll say a few phrases, and then I'm going to repeat them, and I'm going to change the wording slightly. So as I say these, I want you to think about just a typical, nothing too charged, but a typical time in your week when you might feel this. And then I'm going to change the wording. This will make sense to you in a second. And so as I say these words, I invite you to say them in your own mind out loud to yourself. And really then feel in your body what comes up for you when you hear this and say this to yourself. All right. So it's like, I'm so angry. I'm so angry. And just feel whatever that evokes in you as you might think about a time when you experience something like that. Okay. The next one is, I'm so anxious. I'm so anxious. and just kind of feel that in your body. And maybe again, a time you would feel that. And the third one I'll throw out is, I'm so stupid. I'm so stupid. And again, just really pay attention to what happens in your body when you say that to yourself. And now I'm going to go through each of those again, and I'm going to add the phrase, I noticed that. And I want you to see if anything shifts or changes for you as we go through this again. So I notice that I'm feeling a lot of anger in my body right now. I notice that I'm feeling a lot of anger in my body right now. I notice that my body is going into a survival response of anxiety. I notice that my body is going into a survival response of anxiety right now. I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm so stupid. I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm so stupid. So I'm curious for you, did you sense any different?
Oh yes. It takes you out of your, it's so funny. It just seems so simplistic in some ways, but yes, it takes it. I believe it takes you out of thinking and more into feeling or noticing. And it just seems so simplistic to me. But it just in terms of it, I don't know how to describe it, but it's just like, well, there's your answer. You know what I mean? Not that it's easy, not that it's easy, but yes, it absolutely takes me out of my, I don't know how to describe it. It gets me looking, which is different than feeling, but not feeling, but ruminating or the continuous, it felt like I had a, sort of like a mission or something, like, okay, what is this doing to me or whatever. It's just, and it's again, it seems so simplistic, but it's just, I think once you master this, or I shouldn't say master, because I don't know if you ever get to that, but I think once you practice regularly this skill, it is a game changer. It is a life changer. And you will always need to practice for sure. But once you become comfortable with it, it changes everything. For me, it changes everything.
Yeah. Simple, but not easy, right?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. And so this metaphor of the flashlight is really mindful awareness. It's really relating to our inner experiences with a different kind of attention. So rather than being caught in it, and so let me share this little analogy, metaphor, either way, that somebody shared with me. But imagine that there's a river with a strong current, and that you are, in the river, and you're kind of being pulled down the river by that current, right? And you're sort of splashing and thrashing about, and there you go, right? And mindfulness, or this mindful awareness, is like stepping out of the river and sitting on the bank of the river. And that water, that current is still strong, and it's still going, and it's pulling things down along with it, but you're able to sit on the bank and watch it, or even watch the ships pull by, but you're not getting dragged along in it. And so by just being able to step back and take that half step back and notice what's happening, it allows for just that little bit of space where we're not so swept away by whatever we're feeling. And in that space, we have more choice about how we respond. So I think that is one really helpful skill to cultivate. But another one that I think about, and this goes back to something you were saying a few minutes ago, is what I call this tool of an anchor. And this idea of how do we anchor our nervous system in some felt sense of safety, even in the midst of, so picture, a ship in the harbor and it drops its anchor. And so even though there may be big turbulent waves and big passing storms, that ship remains safely anchored there. And to be able to find ways where we can do this in our own body and our own nervous system, even in the midst of really challenging situations, I think is immensely helpful. And one of the ways we can do this is by regulating our breathing. And I know a lot of people talk about, or, have heard, take a few deep breaths. And
Right.
it's easy. It seems like a little silly sometimes, or, okay, well, that's,
Yeah.
and my grandmother told me to do,
Right.
But there's a lot of really important science behind that as we can regulate our breathing, we're actually changing what's happening at our autonomic nervous system. So here's a little fun experiment to just try this one out. Sure. I'm curious, just for your listeners as well. I'm gonna invite you to take a deep breath, and just so, however you do that, take a deep breath or two right now and just notice kind of how you do that in your body. Okay.
Right.
So I have the luxury here of watching you, so I can see that you took both a deep inhalation, but also like a deep exhalation. Right? A lot of people, when we think about taking a deep breath, they focus on the inhalation. They just kind of,
Right.
breathe in a lot of air. And when we're charged, when we're feeling more of that fight or flight, anger or anxiety or different flavors thereof, when we actually breathe in and accentuate the inhalation, it can rev up our sympathetic nervous system in a way that's not so helpful. When we want to calm down, when we want to bring more calm energy into our nervous system, we want to accentuate the exhalation, because every time we exhale, we are actually slowing down the heart rate. There's, I guess I won't get into all the science behind it, but that's the bottom line of it. So if you're feeling anxious or angry or more revved up, if you let the breath come in naturally through your nose without trying to inhale too deeply, and take a really nice slow exhalation, really making that exhalation longer than the inhalation. You might even imagine like blowing out like through pursed lips, like through a straw. Sometimes that helps to slow down the exhalation, or even a deep sigh. That actually sends cues of safety to our autonomic nervous system that there's no real threat here. Now, alternatively, if we're feeling really low and down and stuck, then we may want to accentuate the inhalation. We may want to actually take some deeper breaths in, because that energizes, that helps mobilize us, that turns on that sympathetic nervous system, which maybe we need a little mobilized energy if we're sort of feeling like we just want to crawl in bed and pull the covers over our head. So that can be helpful. So interesting, that's just one example of a kind of, using our breath as an anchor, of anchoring our nervous system in a way that can then help us feel more safe and grounded too.
I mean, this stuff is just so fascinating to me. It's like there are answers to deal with these emotions. It's not like it's impossible to get through these things, to come out. I think especially if you learn some of these skills, to come out better than you were before. It seems and feels so hopeless in the beginning, but there are ways to make yourself feel better. It's not a cure-all in terms of if you're just starting out your divorce. It's very devastating, but you can have these moments of I don't know, peace for a few moments, where you can sort of relax, not ruminate, not get caught up in the what ifs and all that kind of stuff. And I think I always come back to this. I feel like the answer to all of it, and it sounds Well, it sounds there's a couple things that I'm sure that it sounds to folks, but it's all about mindfulness, right? It's all about being aware of your thoughts and being able to realize that you aren't your thoughts and that
Yeah.
you can change your thoughts again through some of these skills that we described. I really feel like, gosh, the secret to life is really mindfulness. I know people hear that and they're like, I don't know, they think about monks sitting around going, oh, or whatever, but but like that's not what I'm talking about. The ability to just be able to step back and see or know your thoughts or whatever without being wrapped up in them. It's just
Yeah.
it's so important.
And I think on that note, really being aware of our narratives.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
we feel like our nervous system reacts, and then we create these stories
Yep.
about what's going on. And often these stories can be inaccurate, they can be distorted, they can be unhelpful.
1000% yes. Yes.
Yeah, and they can come from all kinds of things. Often they can come from our childhoods,
Childhood. Yeah. Yeah.
messages that we learned,
Yeah.
you're not, if you show sadness, you're not strong and
Yes.
tough, or
Yes.
you should or shouldn't feel certain things, or a lot of people, carry around feelings of I'm not good enough in some way,
Yeah.
deep at our core,
Yep.
that there can be that.
Yep.
Or, maybe for people going through a divorce, it's not uncommon to have narratives that are along the lines of, what's wrong with me? I'm not lovable in some way.
Yes. I'm a failure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
And when we get stuck in these narratives, or often, by the way, we don't even realize how much those narratives are present in our mind. So
Yep.
part of it is then shining the flashlight. Aha, okay, let me see what am I actually saying to myself here, and then stopping to say, is this actually true?
Yeah.
Do I know this to be true? Is this factual, or is this me interpreting, or maybe even, you know, distorting what's going on? And when we can step out of those narratives,
Yep.
it can really bring a lot of powerful freedom, or change those narratives to be more accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. I did some work with narrative therapy. And man, did I find that really, really helpful. It is just about writing your story essentially, and then writing it, um, you know, in a hopeful way or with a different perspective. I am this way because this is what I needed to do to survive, or
Oh,
make it through as a child or whatever.
yeah.
Because you're right, we get locked into, especially from childhood. It all goes back to childhood. Let's be
Mhm.
honest.
Yeah.
We get these stories in our head about who we are because that's what we're told by folks. And then sometimes, I think a lot of times, maybe all times, honestly, we also choose mates who end up telling us that same story in some ways. Maybe not initially, obviously the honeymoon period, and maybe there's years and whatever, but I think eventually these stories, they sort of become self-fulfilling prophecies in a sad kind of way. And being
Mm,
able to change that narrative, but just be aware of it. Again, mindfulness.
yeah.
Like, what am I telling myself about myself? If you can answer that question in a a non biased way, it's just, gosh, it's so powerful and helpful. And it really can lead you to hope, which is sometimes very hard to find when you're going
Yeah.
through a divorce.
And often, I think another piece that can be really powerful and hard,
Mm,
and not one that comes naturally to most people, I think, is to be able to bring some self-compassion
mhm.
to what we're experiencing. And maybe even when people hear that word, there may be a lot of
Sure.
autonomic nervous system reactions to that word.
Yep.
Um, but when we can really meet ourselves where we are,
Yep.
and when one way to think about it is, kind of, if you were sitting with a buddy who's going through a divorce,
Yes.
how would you sit with them?
Yep.
How would you be present
Yep.
with their suffering, their pain? And you probably just listen, you'd hold a space, you might be encouraging, you might
Yep.
be, just kind of put an arm, hey, I'm
Yep.
here.
Yep.
and it's learning how to do that for ourselves.
Yeah. 100%.
Trying to do that for ourselves. And when we can hold our own suffering in that way, it is transformative. I have seen that time and again. And not always easy to do on our own, which is why I think sometimes working with a therapist, my bias, of course, but also my experience. Like I've been in my own therapy plenty of years.
Oh, you'll get no argument from me on that front. I am not a therapist, but I mean, there are a few things in life I think that everybody should be in therapy. We were raised by fallible humans who made plenty of mistakes, and as a parent, I may make them more often than I would like. So I know that we're all damaged to varying degrees. And the only way to sort that shit out is to get into therapy. I couldn't recommend that enough. A good therapist. It's just like dating. Don't settle, because
that's important.
Because I don't think the title of doctor or therapist or whatever doesn't mean they're infallible either. And so you have to make it, and some of it too, I think it's like comfortability. Like, am I comfortable with this person? But don't pick just anyone. Pick a good one, and a good one is invaluable to life in my view.
Yeah, I think that's important. A goodness of fit for sure.
Yeah,
to find somebody that you're comfortable with, and I know for me it's been life-changing.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned ACT a couple of times, acceptance commitment therapy. What? I've never heard of that. Could you, if you don't mind, could you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, so just to say, in the context of what we're talking about, one of the things that so there's really this idea of accepting our internal experiences and committing to valued actions, identifying like what is really most important to us, and how can we take actions based on that, and be willing to experience uncomfortable emotions in the process. So let me say that there's something they call experiential avoidance. And it's this idea that we can not only avoid our own uncomfortable emotions, but we can then start to avoid the experiences in which those emotions might show up. So if I'm anxious about going to social in certain social situations, right? I don't like the feeling of anxiety. And so now I'm going to start to avoid going into certain situations that potentially could evoke that anxiety for me. And as I do that, my life is going to become a little bit smaller, right? And so, and I mean, we could talk about that with sadness maybe, or with a breakup, and in the sense of protecting. I'm going to protect my heart, and I'm going to like not allow myself to ever feel hurt again, right? And so, but this experiential avoidance actually, again, can make our life smaller. We're not able to sort of live fully and wholly in that way. And so part of what ACT teaches is how can we develop the willingness to experience some discomfort, that is part of our human condition. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if I'm willing to experience a little bit of anxiety, and I know, that might happen. Hey, coming on and doing this podcast, right? I always get a little bit of a mix of excitement and anxiety.
Sure.
But if I wasn't willing to experience some of that, then I close myself off from these opportunities. So it's developing that willingness to be able to go after those things that we really want in our lives, and then to identify the values. What are the values that we're committed to? And so I'm committed to helping other people. And if I can come on this podcast, and maybe that means that I have to feel a little bit nervous and anxious, prior to, but if I can help one person, right, that helps me get through it. And I've kind of another tool that I call the beacon. just a name that I came up with, is this idea of, think about a beacon, like a beacon of light that guides ships to safe harbor.
Yep.
And those ships might start to veer off course, but the beacon, if you hold the beacon out in sight, you stay aligned with your course.
Yep.
And similar with us in life, if we can identify what is it that we're most deeply committed to, who is it that we want to be, how do we want to show up, and hold that out in front of us like a beacon of light, it can help us, I would say, not override, I'm not sure that's the best word, but manage these difficult emotions that may be present in order to show up as our best self. So, if I'm able to, let's say I'm going through a divorce and there's a lot of rage and anger about, interacting with my ex. And yet part of my value is, core value of, I want to really create as harmonious an environment for my kids as possible. And that's my beacon. Then even as I'm getting activated by certain things that may, really bring up, let's say, strong emotion of anger or something, holding that beacon out in front of me and being able to really be committed to what's important to me, it helps to work through or override, so you have more choice. But this is how I want to act, despite the fact that these feelings are here, I'm going to choose these actions.
Yeah, it's about knowing your values to sort of keep you on your path, right? Or in some ways, I guess, giving you a path. Because I find I did some similar work where I learned some of my values, but it was not anything that I really did before. Like I knew like some of the things I believed or whatever, but I never sat down and said, okay, what are my values? And when you learn those, then it allows you to make decisions based on those and keep you going towards yourself in a way, right? It doesn't, you won't, I mean, not that you can't stray or make mistakes. We all do that kind of shit, but it's more about you're sort of following your path and sticking to it. I think it provides, talk about safety and comfort. I believe it does that, because no matter what, I'm sticking and going this way, and that's my way, and based on my values, and I love the description of a beacon. I think that's awesome. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and it does activate a different part of the brain when we can connect in with what we care about. It connects. It does turn on a different part of the brain that again can help us manage whatever those strong emotions are. I'm thinking about a particular situation where my son ended up in the emergency room. It was kind of one of these New Year's Eve, get woken out of sleep, like having to deal with and think. Anyway, at the time, I really tried to hold on to my beacon because I was extremely anxious about what was going on. It was unclear, we was just having some strange medical things happening. And so my beacon in that moment was to try to be a calm presence for him. And that didn't mean that, of course I still felt super anxious, but by just holding that out in front of me, it's like, okay, this is how I want to show up for him. It really did help me to focus on that. And this is something that I care about. And so it helped me navigate my own challenging emotions in that moment.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. I didn't know my own until maybe 2 years ago when I went through a program that was sort of the central part of the program is finding out your values, and I've used it since, and it absolutely helps you, gives you a direction, maybe even uncovers your purpose in a way, which is kind of what it did for me. Honestly, it led me to where I am now. When I learned, connection and leadership, love, when I learned that these are some of my values, it was like, well, what do I do with that? Well, here you go. Here's some things you can do. And clearly this podcast fulfills that. Beth, I want to thank you. I think we could probably talk for a couple of days on this stuff because I'm fascinated by the topic. I'm going to ask you one last question which is the last one I ask everybody, and then we'll get to how can people find you and your books and all that kind of good stuff.
Sure.
So the last question I ask everyone is, what words of wisdom would you impart to a man who is just starting his divorce process?
So first of all, I'd say listen to your podcast, because you've done a lot of work yourself, and it's really clear from you doing this and how you talk and share, and so I think you have a lot of wisdom to impart. So some things I would say is, one, seek support. And one of the things maybe I didn't talk too much about it, but is just the utmost importance of social connection and social support. And so that is so important, to have supportive people that one can talk to. I think another thing is I would put in a plug for talking to a therapist. If, again, that's my bias, but if one needs it, if one is really feeling overwhelmed and struggling, this idea of just knowing you don't have to do this alone.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important. And it's not a sign of weakness in any way. I think the opposite. I think being able to reach out for help, whether to friends or to a therapist or whomever, is a great sign of strength. I think that knowing that there is a mourning process, that a divorce is a kind of a death. This is a death of a relationship, and it's okay and normal and important to be able to grieve in whatever way, shape, or form that looks like. And so to give oneself permission to do that, and to know that there's no right way or wrong way to go through that, or to feel. Also being aware of those unhelpful narratives, though, to really be able to catch those, so that you're not getting pulled into the grip of that. I would say, if there's any kids involved, one of the biggest gifts that you can give the kids would be to really minimize conflict as much as possible, and not talk badly about the ex to the kids. I think that would certainly be some advice, hopefully to trickle down and have a positive effect there. And then finally, is this idea of kind of building a container safety for your nervous system. And I borrow that phrase from Michael Allison, who I'm taking a wonderful class with, but this idea of having routines, of having, maybe it's exercise, breathing, meditation, social connection, movement, creative expression, music, being in nature, having these healthy go-to strategies for when you're stressed, for when you're, struggling, and being able to identify what those things are, to help you through.
Yeah, I mean, you hit them all. Excellent words of advice to everybody. Thank you so much for that. Where can people find you and your book, and what's the best way to reach Beth?
Yeah. And actually, do you mind if I throw out one more?
Oh, no, go ahead.
I just thought of that I didn't want to miss, because it's
go for it.
Interesting. But being able to take pen to paper and to sometimes write what one is experiencing, feeling, can also be another way of stepping out of, these mental ruminations, and being able to get a little perspective. And there's just a fascinating study that I came across before you had reached out to me about doing this interview, where they had, and this is from a book called Emotional Agility. But she talked about these 100 senior engineers who had been laid off, and most of these men were in their 50s, and they couldn't find work. So after 4 months, they took this group of them who hadn't been able to find work, and they did this intervention where they asked some of the group to write about their feelings, about their emotions of, being laid off and so forth. And then there was a control group. And what they found was that the men who delved into their emotions through this journaling were 3 times more likely to get reemployed than the control group, because the writing not only helped them to process the emotions, but then because they processed their emotions, they were able to take more meaningful and helpful actions. So that's just another kind of last tool I'll throw out, but I think there's some power in the writing.
Yeah, no, agreed. I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of where people can find me, I have a website, which is just my name, bethkurland.com, Kurland, bethkurland.com. And on my website, I have a bunch of resources. Also, people can find me on Insight Timer if they're interested in any of my meditations, or I have 2 audio courses that help with stress.
Nice.
Yeah, so there's
Awesome.
probably the easiest.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. We will definitely have to do it again. There's definitely more info to be mined here. Before we go, I want to ask you to hang on, because I got a couple questions for you, and sometimes I forget to say that to people when they sign off. So hang on for a few minutes. But again, thank you so very much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. Thank you to Nick Coyle and Lifer for allowing me to use their song, Born Again, which you're hearing now and at the intro to the podcast. Thank you to Justin Dillahanty and all of my brothers at the Alpha Code. Please visit the website risingphoenixpodcast.com to connect with me and other like-minded men who are looking to thrive and grow after their divorce. And remember to surround yourself with people who add value to your life, who challenge you to be greater than you were yesterday, who sprinkle magic into your existence like you do to theirs. Life is not meant to be done alone. Find your tribe. Take care.